my sister told me I'd always need them. That without the family name behind me, I was nobody. She said it the night they sat me down at the kitchen table and informed me, not asked, informed, that my position at my father's contracting company had been restructured. I was 26. I had worked there for 4 years, and my brother-in-law had just been promoted into the role they built around my work. That was 8 years ago. Last spring, my father called me for the first time since the funeral, not to apologize, to ask if I could save what was left of the business. I didn't say yes, but I didn't hang up either, not yet. The kitchen table that night had the same yellow overhead light it always did, the kind that makes everyone look a little sick. My mother sat at the far end, hands folded, eyes down. My sister was beside my father, close enough that their shoulders touched. And I remember thinking she looked like she was trying to become part of his chair. They'd rehearsed this. I could tell by the way my father cleared his throat before he started talking, and my sister didn't blink. He used words like liability and direction and the company's future. He said they needed someone with a different energy. What he meant was they needed someone who wouldn't ask questions. I had started asking questions about the subcontractor billing, about the permits that weren't lining up with the invoices, about numbers that didn't make sense on jobs I was managing. I'd brought it up twice. The second time, my sister told me I was being paranoid. 2 weeks after that conversation, I was restructured. I drove home that night with nothing but a cardboard box of desk items, and a feeling I hadn't had since I was a kid. The specific shame of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to choose you. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment complex for a long time before I went inside. My roommate at the time asked if I wanted to talk. I said no. I heated up soup I didn't taste and went to bed before 9. The next morning I started over. I found a project management job at a mid-sized construction firm in Charlotte within 6 weeks. I wasn't managing family money or covering for family mistakes. I was just working. It felt clean in a way I hadn't expected. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted. Within 4, I was running operations for their Southeast division. I bought my own condo, paid off my student loans, stopped waiting for an apology that was never coming. My father and I exchanged texts at Christmas for the first 2 years. Then even that stopped. My sister tried once around year 3 to send a message about a family reunion I wasn't invited to but was apparently expected to approve of. I read it, set my phone face down, and didn't respond for 4 days. When I did, I kept it to 2 sentences. She didn't write back. I built a life that had nothing to do with them, and I was good at it. Then my mother died. I flew home for the service and kept to myself. There were cousins I hadn't seen in years, old neighbours, people from my parents' church. My sister stood near the casket in a black dress that cost more than my first car and accepted condolences like she was accepting awards. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Greyer. He hugged me once, stiff and brief, and said, "I'm glad you came. Not I'm sorry. Not I've missed you." Just the minimum acknowledgement that I had shown up, which apparently counted as an act of generosity on his part. I left the reception before dinner, drove back to the airport hotel I'd booked because I hadn't wanted to sleep under their roof. Lay on a bed that smelled like industrial detergent and stared at the ceiling until 2 in the morning. I wasn't grieving them. I was grieving what I'd wanted them to be for the last 8 years and never stopped hoping for, even when I pretended I had. The call from my father came 4 months later. He didn't open with small talk. He never did. He said the company was in trouble. Bad trouble. I asked him what kind, and he was quiet for a moment in a way that told me the answer was worse than he wanted to admit out loud. He said there were some debts, some decisions that hadn't gone well. My brother-in-law, it turned out, had made a series of calls on a commercial project in Raleigh that went sideways, permitting issues, a contractor dispute that turned into litigation, cost overruns they hadn't disclosed to the client. They were looking at a lawsuit. The client was a regional developer with a real legal team, not someone they could outlast. My father said my name like a question. I didn't answer right away. What I wanted to say was, "You took the job I built and gave it to the man your favourite daughter married, and now you want me to clean up what he broke." What I actually said was that I'd need to think about it. He said, "Okay." He sounded relieved just that I hadn't said no. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen island for a long time with a glass of water I didn't drink. I thought about the subcontractor billing I'd flagged years ago, the permits that didn't line up, the questions nobody wanted me asking. I wondered how much of what they were dealing with now had roots in what I'd seen then, and how much of it would have been preventable if anyone had listened. Then I opened my laptop and started looking. It took me 3 evenings to build a clear picture. Public records, court filings, the business registry in our home state, contractor licensing board complaints. The Raleigh lawsuit was real, and it was bad. The developer was seeking damages significant enough to hollow out the company's reserves. There were 2 other liens I found that my father hadn't mentioned. A line of credit that had been drawn down close to its limit. And the company's bonding capacity, which they needed to bid commercial projects, was under review. My brother-in-law had not just made bad calls, he had made them confidently and repeatedly, and when things started unraveling, based on what I could piece together, he had started moving money between accounts in ways that were going to be very hard to explain to anyone with a CPA or a subpoena. I called my own attorney before I called my father back. Her name was not one they would recognize. I'd met her through a professional network 3 years earlier and had kept her on a small retainer ever since, mostly because I'd learned that having someone in your corner before you need them is not paranoia. It's just sense. I told her what I'd found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "If you engage with this at all, you engage with documentation. You do not walk into that building as a daughter. You walk in as a consultant." I told her I understood. She said, "I want to make sure you actually understand. They will try to make it personal. That's where you lose if you let them." I told her I'd been practicing not letting them for 8 years. She almost laughed. "Okay, call me before you get on the plane." I contacted my father and told him I would come and look at things. I said clearly, directly, that if I came, it would be in a professional capacity, that I would need access to the financials, and that anything I recommended would be based on what I found, not on what was comfortable or what protected anyone's feelings. He was quiet again, then he said yes. I drove this time. 8 hours. I listened to a podcast about organizational restructuring for the first 5, and then turned it off and just drove in silence. My sister met me at the door of my parents' house, which is where my father had asked to meet before going to the office. She was wearing the expression she always wore when she was pretending to be warm, a smile that sat at the surface and didn't reach anything underneath. She hugged me. I let her. She said it was really good to see me, that she hoped we could put everything behind us, that family was what mattered in the end. I said I was there to look at the books. Her smile held, but something behind her eyes shifted. My brother-in-law was at the kitchen table when I came in. He was dressed like he was going to a business lunch, pressed shirt, no tie, the particular effort of a man who wants to appear casual while also appearing important. He extended his hand, and I shook it because it wasn't worth the energy not to. He started talking immediately about market conditions and the difficulty of the current construction environment and how the Raleigh developer had been unreasonable from the start. I let him finish. Then I asked him to pull up the project ledger for the Raleigh job. He said he'd have the accountant send it over. I said I'd like to see it now, from the source files, not a summary. There was a pause. My sister filled her coffee cup. My father looked out the window. My brother-in-law said he wasn't sure the raw files were accessible from here, that most things were on the office server. I said that was fine, I'd look at them at the office. We went to the office. What I found there took the better part of 2 days. I brought a legal pad and a portable drive, and I worked through the records methodically, the way I'd learned to do when I was managing projects, and no one was going to double-check my work but me. I found the permitting irregularities. I found charges billed to the Raleigh project that were for materials delivered to a different job, which meant either the accounting was catastrophically careless, or the project had been used to float expenses elsewhere. I found a vendor payment that had gone to an LLC that didn't have a registered agent in any of the 4 states where they claimed to operate. On the second afternoon, I drove to a coffee shop 2 miles from the office and called my attorney. I read her my notes for 40 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is worse than you described," she said. "I know. You cannot save this company without exposing some of what's in those records, and depending on what a forensic accountant finds, some of this may not be yours to fix. It may need to go to a different kind of authority." I already knew that. I had known it since the first hour in the file room, when I found the vendor payment that went nowhere. I just needed to hear it from someone who wasn't inside my own skull. I drove back to my parents' house that evening. My father was alone in the living room. My sister and brother-in-law had gone home for the night. He looked up when I came in, and I could see in his face that he already knew I had found things. Not the details, just that I had found them. I sat down across from him. I told him what I'd seen. I didn't soften it. I told him about the ledger discrepancies, about the vendor LLC that didn't hold up, about the way the Raleigh accounts had been used. I told him that the company's exposure was significant, and that some of what I'd found was beyond a business problem. It was the kind of thing that needed legal counsel immediately, not mine, his, and not counsel who would try to make it disappear, but someone who could advise him properly on what disclosure looked like and what the alternatives were. He didn't interrupt me. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance and listened. When I finished, the room was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator running from the kitchen. Finally, he said, "I didn't know the details. I believed him." My father was not a sophisticated fraudster. He was a man who had trusted his son-in-law the same way he'd once trusted me, but with fewer questions and more patience, because my brother-in-law had married the daughter, who'd never embarrassed him. "That's not a defense," I said. "But it's something." Really looked at me, the way he hadn't at the funeral, the way he hadn't at the kitchen table 8 years ago. "I should have listened to you," he said. "When you brought those questions, I should have listened. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't, and we were both too old to pretend otherwise. What I said was, you should get an attorney on the phone tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." He nodded. I gave him the name of someone my attorney had recommended, a firm that handled exactly this kind of situation. I told him they were good, and they were straightforward, and they would tell him the truth even when the truth was hard. My sister called me at 9 that night. I didn't answer. She called again at 9:15. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left started with my name said in the particular tone she reserved for when she thought she was being wrong. It moved quickly to the suggestion that I was attacking the family and making things worse, and doing this because of old grudges. At the end, she said she hoped I was proud of myself. I deleted it. The next morning, I drove back to Charlotte. I stopped once for gas and once for coffee, and otherwise just moved. It felt like something was releasing with every mile, a pressure that had been sitting behind my sternum for 2 days in that office, longer than that if I was honest. 3 weeks later, my brother-in-law's attorney contacted my attorney. They wanted a statement about what I had reviewed and in what capacity. I provided one through counsel, precise and factual. I did not editorialize. I did not include anything that wasn't documented. I didn't need to. The Raleigh developers' lawsuit proceeded. The forensic accountant that my father's new attorney brought in confirmed most of what I'd found and surfaced additional issues I hadn't had access to. My brother-in-law engaged his own separate representation, which told its own story about where accountability was landing. My sister stopped calling after the 4th unanswered voicemail. My father and I spoke twice more over the following months. They were careful conversations, not warm, not cold. He thanked me once for being honest with him, and I said I had only told him what was there. He asked how my work was going, and I told him. He didn't ask me to come back to the company. I think we both understood that door had been closed for a long time, and neither of us was going to pretend it was ajar. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I ran into a woman at a conference in Raleigh, of all places. She was a contractor, independent, had built her own firm from scratch in her early 30s, after leaving a family business that had, as she put it, decided I was more useful as a cautionary tale than an employee. We talked for an hour over bad conference coffee, and I didn't mention any of what was happening, just listened to her describe what the first few years of building something on your own terms felt like. She said the hardest part wasn't the money or the clients or the competition. The hardest part was unlearning the belief that you needed their approval to know your own work was good. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I'm not a person who believes things happen for a reason, not in the tidy narrative sense. But I do think that being pushed out of that company at 26 was the thing that made me into someone who knew how to walk back in at 34 and see it clearly. Not with anger, not with grief, just with clear eyes and a legal pad and 8 years of doing the work that nobody in that family had chosen to see. My mother used to say I was too serious, that I needed to learn to let things go. I think what she meant was that I needed to stop noticing things that made the people around her uncomfortable. I never figured out how to do that. I'm not sure I wanted to. A few months after I got back to Charlotte, I updated my LinkedIn profile. Nothing dramatic. I just added a line to the summary section that I'd left blank for years. It said, "Built from scratch, led by my own standards." A former colleague messaged me the same day to ask if I was available for a consulting engagement. I said I was. I didn't hear from my sister again for almost 6 months. When she finally wrote, it was a short message. Nothing apologetic, nothing specific, just "I hope you're doing well." A door held slightly open, waiting to see if I'd walk through it and let everything go unsaid again. I read it, sat with it for a day. Then I wrote back, "I am. I hope the same for you." Not forgiveness, not a wound reopened, just 2 sentences that said, "I see you reaching, and I'm not going to pretend you didn't do what you did, but I'm also not going to carry this forever." That's not closure someone hands you. That's the kind you build yourself, quietly, out of the same material you used to build everything else. I closed the app and went back to work.